Let me ask you a question about NATO. What is the purpose of NATO? Both the said purpose and kind of what that transformed into, so people can understand. Because you said Jeremy Corbyn wanted Britain to leave NATO.
Yeah. So NATO's original purpose was as an alliance of states to defend against Soviet aggression. That was the idea. Um, it could, from a Soviet standpoint, be viewed as an alliance of states to thwart Soviet aims and to threaten the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union would not pursue the expansion of communism into other countries in Europe. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are more questions about what NATO is for. Russia isn't as capable as the Soviet Union was of potentially invading other countries or using infiltrators to change other countries' governments. The Soviet Union in the immediate post-war period did try to help communist movements in Western European countries to a degree, mostly unsuccessfully. But nowadays, Russia is not really in a position to do that. Oftentimes, we inflate the threat Russia poses. Their GDP is smaller than Britain's. They have military forces that are very out of date and not nearly as effective as the Soviet army. So now, what is NATO for? Well, if we don't really think that Russia is in a position to invade countries, then NATO must be for expanding the pressure on Russia. So since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've added a lot of Eastern European countries that used to be either in the Warsaw Pact or in the Soviet Union to NATO. And this has allowed us to move our military installations that were used as defenses against the Soviet Union closer and closer to Russia. So Russia interprets this as us treating them as if they are still an enemy. And so they view it as threatening, and they are very hostile to any additional countries that are interested in joining NATO, like Georgia in 2008. Georgia has been very interested in joining NATO, and for that reason, the Russians engaged in a conflict with Georgia in 2008. And more recently in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government began to cozy up with the European Union and with NATO, and the Russians do not want any more countries to go into NATO because they don't want NATO troops moving any closer to the border with Russia.
Now, it's strange that in the U.S. media, and again, I'll refer to them as the mass propaganda machine, they make it seem as though Russia is always the aggressor in our conflicts. They make it seem like Russia is pushing the bounds of containment. Even the idea of the policy of containment on Russia in itself is an aggressive stance. Yeah. But what you just laid out is, it seems to me as though perhaps the United States is the actual aggressor.
Yeah, Russia is a declining power. It is increasingly dependent on petroleum and natural gas. And of course, oil prices collapsed a few years ago, and that's really hurt their economy. They've lost a lot of territory and a lot of population relative to the Soviet period. They're not really in a strong position to aggress. We look at Ukraine, and Ukraine has been portrayed as this picture of Russian aggression. But until very recently, Ukraine was a strong ally of Russia. And it was because Russia was getting weaker that Ukraine became interested in leaving the Russian alliance and going over to the West. I think we very often inflate the level of threat that Russia poses. Of course, because Russia is a nuclear power, we can't invade Russia or depose its government very efficiently or effectively, even if we wanted to do that. But Russia's also not in a position to really go after us, because not only does the West have a large nuclear arsenal of its own, but the West has much, much stronger economy and much, much larger military outlays than Russia. If you add all of NATO together and you added Russia and NATO's military expenditure together, Russia would be about 5% of the total. It's not even close to parity.
That is, I'm sure I keep on saying that's interesting, or I'm shocked, but I'm not shocked. These are all things I fervently believe, and I've already kind of read. Really, I'm for our audience, just trying to basically kind of navigate that, and just try to break that down for everybody who's watching the show, so we can understand that for the most part, everything that we hear on the media about foreign relations and things of that nature is all BS. most of it is BS, and you're going to have to really dig deep before you can find more accurate narratives on what's really going on in the world, especially in regards to the U.S. and its actions. And I think during the show, I would ask 4 questions. When was the last time the United States stood in the way of peace? When was the last time the United States stopped a peace agreement or a peace accord in some way, shape, or form? According to the United States, according to, the West-oriented media, the United States has never stood in the way of peace. But if you go outside of the United States, outside of the Western aligned media, the United States is the number one propagator of violence and things of that nature around the world. So
it depends on what kind of peace you want. And a lot of the time we go, well, we're not standing in the way of peace, but that's because we're only not standing in the way of the kinds of pieces that we are willing to accept. And I don't want to make it sound like it's only the United States that acts in this way. A lot of other countries also have their own media operations that advance their own points of view. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Russia today is not every bit as much a mouthpiece for the Russian point of view as our media sometimes is for ours. But you often have to try to look for the balance and try to get past the noise of all medias in all countries, because medias in any country are likely to take the international relations point of view of that country.
Yes. And, you'll find that on the BBC, they talk a lot about America, but they don't really talk much about Britain. Canada's media is the same thing. So, I kind of frame this like I'm going all against America, and I think I need to kind of back that off. You're right. I need to explain that all institutions in their countries kind of take the view of that country in regards to putting out, a favorable view on the home state and what they're doing in the world. Now, sometimes that may be completely at odds with the reality. Sometimes it may be close. There's varying degrees of that. But I just think that that's something important that we have to understand. And so when people come with an anti-imperialistic message, it could be that just because we haven't heard it, it sounds bad, but it could be more accurate than what we've been exposed to before.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to believe that they live in a society that's a good society. They want to believe that they live in a state that's a good state, in a government that has good intentions. They like to think that the people in government are like them and have the same kind of goals and aspirations for themselves and for their country that they have. And so they don't want to believe that these people are up to stuff that they really maybe shouldn't be up to. And we have to be sympathetic to that, but at the same time, we don't want to be naively confident in our institutions that they always do the right thing for everybody.
Now, this is interesting because I asked you about NATO because I remember a long time ago someone stated that the official mission of NATO became to control the global energy system, pipelines, and basically what that amounted to was almost like a coalition to kind of dominate the world per se.